So thank you so much for having us and allowing us to open what I'm sure will be a momentous and much-needed conference. Our paper is entitled Representation as Resistance, and it focuses on the underrepresentation of Black practitioners in classical music. I'd like to begin by reading this quote. Non-white races were simply assumed not to belong in classical music. They had their own music. There was the implication they just wouldn't get classical music. The joyous debut of Chineke proved that particular myth is finally dead and buried. Because ethnic minorities are recent arrivals on the classical music scene, they'll bring a fresh perspective to it. They've had to make this tradition their own, and that requires a kind of tenacity, dedication, and love, which the art form will surely benefit from. While well-intentioned, this passage from the London Telegraph's article on the Chineke Orchestra's 2015 debut is both dangerously misguided and erroneous. Indeed, Black classical music practitioners have never flourished in the same numbers as their white counterparts, yet as we see from this image of John Blank, a trumpeter for King Henry VIII, their presence has been documented from as early as the 1500s, and they have existed in some number since that time, if not before. That being said, there is some truth to the Telegraph's commentary regarding these myths of Black incompetency in classical music, and Black practitioners being relegated to their own music. However, this misrepresentation as recent arrivals exemplifies the erasure these musicians have faced from the very beginnings of their practice and their frequent exclusion from musicological and academic discourse. The exclusion of Black musicians from contemporary orchestras has been a topic of convenings conducted by the Mellon Foundation and the League of American Orchestras. Fellowships, councils, and initiatives that intended to promote diversity have existed for over 40 years, but according to the League of American Orchestras, quote, not enough change has come from their implementation. This paper will analyze this push-out of Black classical music practitioners in the framework of 4 E's: erasure, exclusion, excuses, and enclosure. Following this, we will examine how our ensemble, the Dream Unfinished, responds to this framework through our artistic and institutional practices. It will conclude by turning this same critical lens on our own organization and outline potential strategies to transcend our own shortcomings. In 1940, New York City set into motion the razing of San Juan Hill, a predominantly African-American neighborhood, to construct Lincoln Center. The physical displacement of this community and the fact that it is all but forgotten parallels what happens figuratively to many Black practitioners of classical music. While the scope of this paper cannot cover the number of forgotten Black figures in any great detail, there is clear evidence of this erasure ranging from the earliest practitioners to the present day. This erasure manifests itself through omissions of ethnic identity, lost works, public disregard, and the absence of Black composers in all levels of curricula. An early example of omission is Renaissance composer Vicente Lusitano, Portugal's first documented composer of world renown, whose being a pardo, or mulatto, has been almost entirely erased from memory. Continuing into the classical era, there are the 9 lost works of Afro-French composer Chevalier de Saint-Georges, including the first concerto for clarinet, which predated Mozart's by almost a decade. Eileen Southern describes in The Music of Black Americans that this failure to preserve or document classical music by people of African descent continued through the Reconstruction era. As described by Samuel A. Floyd, quote, "We know little about the quantity and the quality of the bulk of works produced by Harlem Renaissance composers. We know even less about the conditions, number, and quality of their performances. With the poor preservation of so many Black composers' oeuvres, these pieces can never be recovered or performed and can only exist as footnotes, if that." The work of Black practitioners has also frequently been eclipsed by white counterparts. At the turn of the century, the public associated ragtime with white interpretations of the style, rather than that of original practitioners such as Eubie Blake and Scott Joplin. Music critic James Huneker asserted that white songwriter Stephen Foster was the most, quote, original composer of African American music. There is also the largely forgotten Harry T. Burleigh, to whom the classical music world owes much of the musical inspiration that became Dvorak's Symphony of the New World. Speculation also persists over what Michael Shapiro described as the, quote, pervasive African-American musical presence in Gershwin's music. Black musical heritage has also been inadequately represented in music education. Following the Music Educator Nationals Conference, MENC, their landmark 1967 Tanglewood Symposium, the MENC produced the Tanglewood Declaration, which demanded that music of all periods, styles, forms, and cultures belong in the curriculum. Yet, over the next 25 years, the MENC's publication, the Music Educators Journal, dedicated only 3 issues to multiculturalism, and only one in 1971, which focused on the music of African Americans. None of these highlighted Black classical composers. In academic scholarship, musicological tracts, such as the Norton Anthologies or Grout's A History of Western Music, have been updated to include musicians of African descent, but Black composers remain marginalized from such resources. They are also largely absent in courses offered by African American studies, musicology, theory, and performance departments. As erasure occurs at the national level and permeates organizations with the most influence, it is little wonder that Black music is excluded from the corpus of classical canon. Like the community of San Juan Hill, the lives and works of these figures have been ostensibly wiped out. The evidence proving systemic erasure is powerful, yet it is tempting to normalize this erasure in the same way that countless white composers have been forgotten to time. For example, many Black composers, like Chevalier de Saint-Georges, may be determined as less worthy of preservation than a genius such as Haydn. Yet the broader field must push back and ask 2 questions. Who decides what enters the canon? And how could we not consider the discrimination and limited access to resources that impacted the output of these composers? What follows is an examination of the opportunities from which Black practitioners have been excluded. There have, of course, existed trailblazers such as Marian Anderson, William Grant Still, Anthony McGill, and the Sphinx Organization. Yet despite these glass ceilings shattered on stage, Black representation off stage lags far behind. According to a study conducted by the League of American Orchestras, from 2006 to 2016, Blacks constituted between 2 to 5% of all conductors. From 2010 to 2014, they accounted for 5 to 7% of orchestral administrative staff, and this number declined. Since 2010, Blacks have made up only 3 to 4% of board membership in American orchestras. With so little representation in key roles that steer the artistic missions of these ensembles, it is no wonder that this is reflected in who we see and don't see on stage. In the 2015 to 2016 season, of the 504 composers performed by American symphony orchestras, only 2 were Black. In 2014, Black musicians formed a mere 1.8% of American orchestra personnel. This number had been stagnant since 2002. This begs the question as to why and how this exclusion exists. One reason is what Leonard Bernstein described as a, quote, subtle kind of oppression, the economic factor, which limits the resources necessary to study an instrument and extends to entering the fields of arts administration or joining a board. In an Ithaca study of the New York City cultural sector, it was revealed that the higher the endowment of an organization, the lower its number of Black and Hispanic board members and senior staff members. Some exclusion was not so subtle, as we see in the frustration expressed by early 20th century composer Florence Price, who stated plainly to conductor Serge Koussevitzky, quote, "I am a woman and I have Negro blood in my veins. Now that you know the worst, will you be so kind as to look at a score of mine?" As recently as 2007, conductor Jerry Lynn Johnson was denied a position after being told that as a young Black female, she was, quote, unmarketable, and, quote, didn't look like what an audience expects a conductor to look like. This disparity in representation also extended to pre-professional musicians. As Alan Locke describes it, after the Civil War, African Americans were largely barred from attending universities with music programs throughout the country, except in, quote, centers liberal enough to accept Black music students, and Black classical music representation in conservatories such as Juilliard and the Manhattan School of Music remain at 5% or less. Black music educators have also been historically underrepresented. The aforementioned Tanglewood Symposium was held to discuss multicultural curricula. Yet when the Music Educators Journal published the proceedings, it revealed that of the 31 participants, only 2 African Americans were present. This disparity remains. As of 2015, African Americans made up only 7% of all music teacher licensure candidates and less than 7% of practicing music educators. Erasure and exclusion are perpetuated further by excuses that blame African Americans for their own lack of representation. In turn, these excuses exemplify the, quote, myth of Black incompetence that was used to validate slavery and Jim Crow legislation. Just last year, National Association for Music Educators President Michael Butera attended a National Endowment of the Arts meeting on diversity and inclusion. Please note that NAFME, this organization, was formerly known as Music Educators National Conference. Butera referenced his all-white board and claimed a diversification of NAFME's membership was impossible because, quote, Blacks and Latinos lack the keyboard skills needed for this field, and implied that music theory is too challenging for them. In Leonard Bernstein's 1947 New York Times article, The Negro in Music, he identifies a common misconception that Blacks don't care for classical music, a generalization affirmed within both Black and white communities. Evidence of this stereotype exists in publications such as the Negro Music Journal, an early 20th century publication written for and by Blacks, which admonished African American enthusiasm of, quote, coon songs, and implored readers to elevate themselves to the music of Bach, Haydn, and Handel. Composer Roy Eaton stated in his 2013 WQXR appearance, quote, most African American homes do not, as a habit, listen to classical music, elaborating that they haven't been shown the possibility and also they don't see role models. Many contemporary orchestras try to include Black composers and personnel, but this often takes place in enclosed spaces and programmatic ghettos. As composer George Walker noted, quote, the classical music industry makes a big thing of Martin Luther King Day and Black History Month, and they think that it is sufficient. It is not. This same kind of ghettoizing is true when artists are pigeonholed into certain roles or productions. For example, while critics and members of the Black press have praised revivals of Gershwin's Porgy and Bess as an entry point for Black singers into the larger field of opera, many Black performers found it challenging to be cast in productions outside of these roles. Radio personality Fred Plotkin affirmed this reluctance was shared by many Black singers, including legendary tenor George Shirley, who only agreed to appear in a production of Porgy and Bess almost 40 years into his career, saying that at the age of 64, he, quote, had nothing to lose. It is to combat these 4 E's and to confront systemic racism in our communities at large that the Dream Unfinished was founded in 2015. The Dream Unfinished is an activist orchestra whose mission is to use classical music as a platform for engaging audiences in dialogues around racial and social justice issues. We combat erasure by programming music by composers of color. We are dedicated to documenting and presenting the totality of classical music and the presence of Black practitioners over the centuries. We address exclusion by prioritizing practitioners of African descent in all aspects of our organization. Our orchestra is approximately 25% Black, our staff is 40% Black, and our advisory board is over 55% Black. We recognize that diversity by itself is not equity. We staff Black personnel and position them in key roles, such as concertmaster, artistic director, and deputy director, to ensure that Black practitioners are at the helm of guiding our artistic and organizational trajectory. We actively work to dispel erroneous excuses of incompetence and disinterest by contracting Black conductors, performers, and soloists, presenting historical works, and commissioning living composers. Lastly, our season very intentionally falls outside of Black History Month and is centered during the spring and summer, which draws attention to Black composers beyond the aforementioned enclosures. As we turn the critical lens back on the Dream Unfinished, we reveal our own shortcomings. The Dream Unfinished commits enclosure by presenting composers of color solely in relation to Black activism, selecting concert dates that mark the death anniversaries of slain figures such as Eric Garner and Sandra Bland, and commissioning pieces limited to social justice-related topics. This contributes to the otherization of Blackness in the field. As an activist orchestra, however, the extra musical demand to be in dialogue with larger societal issues overrides our ability to confront this deficiency. With greater resources, we plan to expand our collaborations with composers of color and create opportunities for composers to choose the content of commissions. With our administration's loose collective-based structure and our recent formulation, as of yet, we are unable to adequately compensate musicians or associated personnel for their time, which may perpetuate a financial gap that exists between Black and white practitioners in the field. However, volunteering one's time and talents is true for all members of our organization, Black, white, or otherwise. We hope that with a firmer internal infrastructure, we will be able to remunerate all involved. Today, we highlighted how classical music as a community and institution has perpetuated the historic structures of racism in the United States and documented our organizational and artistic responses. There remains a huge disparity between the resources available for Black classical music research compared to canonical musics. Yet, such tomes do exist and continue to be published, such as the International Dictionary of Black Composers and the scholarship of Eileen Southern, Samuel A. Floyd, and Dominic René de Lerma, among others. Just 2 days ago, it was announced that the Mellon Foundation will commit over $2.5 million to fund instrumental classical music education in Philadelphia, targeting Black and Latino youth. Indeed, with reports commissioned by the League of American Orchestras and conferences and fellowships exploring diversity in the field, people and organizations are committed to investigating and confronting these issues further. But, as this paper asserts, much more is needed. As we enter the 21st century, it is a duty of classical music to reckon with its past and both accelerate and deepen its efforts to make right these centuries of wrongdoing. We must speed up the day when a Black classical musician is no longer a rarity, when Black practitioners exist beyond tokens, and when diversity and equity both exist within and without our concert halls. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to have we have time for a Q&A session. Are there microphones? I meant to ask this before. So if you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you, I believe. Yes. Would you like to take?
Oh, I can take it.
Oh, no. I was just wondering, Ashley and Eric, did you want to take the podium for the Q&A, or did you all want to sit here? Okay. All right. You're all going to do it together. Okay. All right. We can be very cozy up here. All right. We have a Matthew.
Thank you so much for a very moving paper. That was and also thank you for your organization for what you've done. I have to be one of my dear college principal, Brian, for the piece of your commission, and I think it's just.
Well, you wrote our program notes in 2015.
What I have been trying to figure out is, I think you demonstrated a solution to, and I wonder what your thoughts are, is how we avoid duplicating repetition, narrative
So each season, our orchestra focuses on a different theme. So our inaugural season, it was police brutality. Last year, we focused on Black women of color, so our title, it was entitled Sing Her Name. And this year, we're actually focusing on the school to prison pipeline. And so we're working, and the title is Raise Your Hand. We're going to be creating a side-by-side orchestra, and so it'll be about 20 students and 25 of our professional musicians. And the students will be prepared in a long-term residency. And the music that they're studying is all composers of color, from the Chevalier de Saint-Georges to a living composer. And they'll actually be doing a composition residency with that living composer. So I think at minimum, it's a responsibility for music educators to incorporate this curricula outside of the month of February, and just to show that these composers are, their names belong in halls such as these as well. That's just an immediate thing that people can start doing right away. And then as far as, dismantling all that you said, a lot of it too has to do with the fact that there continue to be a lack of role models. And it's not quite as simple as just throwing money at the problem. It's really, you have to consider why the pipeline has diverted into this direction. And a major issue with a lot of arts organizations that I can say as an administrator now is that there's still the bringing art as a therapy model and art as outreach and serving communities. And I think a big step that we all need to take collectively is learning how to partner with communities and to build long-term relationships with them and see what is already there and tap into that, rather than saying that we're going to save you with our classical music, because they don't need that, quite frankly.
Other questions?
Hi. I also want to say thank you so much for coming to speak. That paper was definitely very enlightening. My question is, you cited a shortcoming of The Dream Unfinished to be the fact that it is specifically an activist orchestra, because it sort of pigeonholes the types of music and programming that you put on. But do you think that racialized art or aesthetics, as a product of being racialized, is inherently political, and therefore can't ever separate itself from that which is socially and culturally active, I guess? Do you see that as a future for your organization or for the field in general, for those two things, the race as a political subject and music to be separate?
So I think that if I'm understanding it, what you're asking is, when we wrote this part and we were analyzing what we're trying to do, I think it's really important to give the choice. And so if a composer of color doesn't want to write something that's inherently political, then they should have the opportunity to do that. I think that what we do for advocacy, it's good to be political, but as we were describing in the paper, there is that aspect of enclosure. So we want to be able to give the opportunity to make a choice, and I think that that's something that's very important, and it's a little bit, I don't know, coming at the issue sideways, but that choice is very important.
I also want to just say that two quotes in response to your question. There's one quote from Virgil Thompson as he was describing his colleague Margaret Bonds, who is a Harlem Renaissance composer. And he told her that to be a black classical musician who reads notation, I'm paraphrasing, but he said to be a black classical musician, that in itself is an anti-establishment act. I'm also going to quote a woman who is at the head of the diversity task force in the Roundtable on Arts and Education in New York City. So she chairs this diversity task force, and she said at a recent meeting, I hope we run ourselves out of business. And so, I think that we have to recognize where we stand and sit now, but then where we absolutely must be working towards.
One more question. We've got a hand up here. Microphone's coming your way.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm wondering, what is the difference between political and non-political music? Like, what's the criteria? Because, everything's political in my opinion, and I'm wondering, like, what does it look like when the music is not political?
Well, in many cases, we're able, if we're lucky enough, we can look at the composer's intention. So that's always kind of a good starting point for determining whether a work is political or not. On the flip side of that, music, the wonderful thing about music is that it means a lot of different things to different people depending on the context, and when you're listening to it and who you're listening with. So it's also kind of that shared experience, and whether that happens to be political for you, that's what it is. I mean, that's not really a sort of concrete answer, but that's, I think, at least for me, one of the joys of making music.
One more quick question. I don't want to get in trouble with our organizers for it, but I know there's going to be a lot of discussion. There's a hand up here.
Thank you for being here and sharing your work with us. At Harvard and at similar universities, there are student ensembles that are often involve students leading and managing, as well as working with faculty to manage programs and repertoire and things like that. And I'm wondering what steps can students take to combat the 4Es that you mentioned and really get at this issue of representation in their ensembles?
I think first and foremost, an easy fix or a more accessible fix is to just do their homework as students and to look actively for repertoire that represents composers of different backgrounds. And as there's a fellow named Michael Kaiser who's big in the New York City arts world. He also had mentioned at a conference recently to not go for the lowest hanging fruit. Because, it's so easy to program William Grant Still because his music is out there. But to really kind of dig in and find composers that captivate you, but that are more circuitous to find. So I think that is certainly an immediate step. And then, just also asking questions of perhaps looking around in your ensembles and asking why they may or may not be as diverse as, if it reflects a student body or the immediate community. What else? What students can do. No, I think students. In general? If, I don't know the nature of these ensembles, but if there is funding available, then, and if you do things like commissions or you have soloists or guest artists, then, reaching out to people and being very intentional that it's not because you want a person of color, but it's because you want their particular talent and their voice and for their contribution to make an impact on your ensemble.
This is a really wonderful start for our first paper. Let's thank our first speakers.